Hello, Dan Alasso here again with Making History. And today I'm going to do another reaction video where I'm going to react to a YouTube video called Why America Joined the Great War, a World War I documentary that has been put out by the channel Kings and Generals. I think this is a pretty good documentary, but there are some points, especially about the timing of some of these things, that I want to stress because I think they might change your understanding of how and why America actually did get into this war. So let's go ahead.
There were countless reasons as to why the US entered into World War I on the side of the Entente powers. Yet the American public saw the European war as a dreadful thing and opposed it completely at its offset in 1914. That same public, just 3 years later, however, strongly supported going to war in 1917. What had changed?
Okay, so there are several reasons. I'm not sure there are countless reasons. Most Americans were against the war because many believed that it was a European conflict and that we really had no stakes in it. Many were more sympathetic actually to the Germans than to the British and French. German Americans were the largest ethnicity in the US and still are. Many people, even non-Germans, considered Germany to be the rising star of Europe and the center of culture and learning. The new German Empire, which right from its start in 1871, when Otto von Bismarck unified all of the German states, right from its start had called itself the Deutsches Reich, the German Empire. It had a population of 41 million, and by the turn of the 20th century, it was outpacing Great Britain in industrial power. Third, many more people, such as the Irish, who were very influential in the Democratic Party, had really no love for the British. And then finally, the United States had a strong tradition, going all the way back to Washington's farewell address, of trying to avoid entangling alliances. So the claim that most of the American public strongly supported the war in 1917 is also problematic. And it depends very much on what types of sources you look at to get a sense of American public opinion. Newspaper headlines, like much of our media today, are often more about trying to direct and channel public opinion than they are about accurately reflecting it. Secondly, in the first 6 weeks after the U.S. declaration of war, only 73,000 men enlisted. Congress had to respond with the Selective Service Act in 1917 and institute a draft. Third, although a few labor unions did support the war, many did not. Labor leader Eugene V. Debs was convicted of sedition for speaking out against the draft. And the United States government felt that it had to enact both a sedition and an espionage law because there was so much resistance to the draft and also really to the war. So finally, it's kind of worth asking ourselves why the government felt that it needed to jail people for sedition if there was so much support by this point for the war.
American companies had been shipping food, raw materials and munitions to both the Entente and Central Powers, but were now being turned away by the Entente Blockade. Wilson tried to get the belligerents to accept the 1909 Declaration of London, which recognized the rights of neutral trade convoys, but the British refused.
Okay, the British blockade killed about 500,000 Germans, 500,000 Germans over the course of the war. And while it may have been ultimately more profitable for Americans to have played both sides and to have supplied both sides in this conflict, it wasn't only the German blockade that resulted in closer ties with Britain and the Entente. The American banking magnate, John Pierpont Morgan, J.P. Morgan, had died in 1913, and he had left the business to his son, J.P. Morgan Jr., known as Jack. And Jack had spent about 8 years training in the London office of J.P. Morgan and Company, where he became very friendly with many British government leaders, including the ambassador, Cecil Spring Rice. Jack was able to leverage this friendship to have J.P. Morgan and Company designated as the sole source purchasing agent for both Britain and France. And this meant that J.P. Morgan and Company managed the Allies' purchases of munitions, food, steel, chemicals, and cotton, and received a 1% commission on all sales. This relationship began in the first years of the war, and ultimately Morgan led a consortium of over 2,000 banks and managed loans to the Allies that exceeded $500 million, which would be nearly $13 billion in today's money. Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, actually objected to the loans and argued that by denying financing to any of the belligerents, the U.S. could hasten the end of the war. And by supplying one side, we were actually losing our neutrality, and we would be unable to remain neutral in this conflict.
Their government did not want to antagonize America further and set up a program to purchase American cotton, and when U.S. ships were stopped by the blockade, the contraband items were purchased by Britain and the cargoless ships were released. The situation angered the Americans, but also resulted in increasing financial ties between the US and the Entente powers. This also rendered the German surface navy useless, leaving it with only one viable naval weapon, the submarine. In 1913, America was undergoing a devastating recession, and before the war's outbreak, the US economy was in a real downturn. When the conflict started, the munition plants in the US began to fill with orders for war materials for the belligerent nations, principally the UK, and economic recovery started. American production went up 32% by 1917, and the gross national product increased by 20%. One of the hardest hit industries by the 1913 recession was the American steel industry, but because of the war, demand skyrocketed.
There was a U.S. recession in 1913. There had been one in 1907, and this was a period in which the business cycle did create regular recessions. This was also the first year of the resumption of the U.S. income tax, which had previously been enacted during the Civil War, but then had been allowed to lapse. The steel industry had also just recently been consolidated in 1901 by J.P. Morgan and Company with the creation of the U.S. Steel Corporation, the world's first billion-dollar corporation. And as a Morgan partner had remarked while the final paperwork was being signed, the merger of over 200 companies in 127 cities had, in this Morgan partner's words, put the steel industry on a large scale into the hands of men who did not know anything about it.
The Naval Blockade, however, meant all of these goods were going to the Entente powers. In spite of the neutrality, the US began to loan far more money to the Entente rather than the Central Powers. J.P. Morgan Bank became the largest lender, financing Britain and France, and J.P. Morgan's New York office was designated the primary financial agent to Britain and primary issuer of loans to France. The loans led to trade, and the trade led to the production of war materials, and thus a precursor to the military-industrial complex as we know it today was being born.
Okay, again, J.P. Morgan and Company's centrality was not an accident. J.P. Morgan's managing director, Thomas Lamont, had presented his views and had signaled the company's plans in a speech that he gave in 1915 to the American Academy of Political and Social Science. And Lamont had observed that because of the war, the United States had an opportunity to shift from being a debtor nation, depending on loans from Europe, and especially from the City of London, to becoming a global creditor. "We are piling up prodigious export trade with war orders," he said, "running into the hundreds of millions of dollars." America was poised, Lamont concluded, to become the trade and finance center of the world, and the dollar to replace the pound sterling as the world's currency. But this would only happen, he warned, quote, if the war goes on long enough. A quick end to hostilities would allow Germany to regain its competitive position. The best result for America would be a long war that ended in German defeat, and of course left the winners deeply in debt to the US, and particularly to J.P. Morgan and Company.
When Germany invaded Belgium in 1914, it engaged in numerous atrocities against the civilian population. Much of this was the result of fears of Belgian guerrillas, which led the German army to burn property, execute civilians, and loot industrial raw materials for the war effort. The Entente powers propagated all of this to great effect, colloquially known as the Rape of Belgium.
This was a war that was filled with atrocity, including, of course, the use of poison gases by first the Central Powers and then ultimately by all of the combatants.
Iconic and graphic imagery depicting Belgium as a brutalized woman ran rampant through the American press. Much of Britain's war propaganda was aimed at attracting American support, and by far and large it worked, despite the fact many of the stories were fabrications. As a result of the Entente Naval Blockade, Germany resorted to using submarine warfare to do the same to Britain which it was doing to Germany, heavily pushed by Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz. The decision to use submarines was made on September the 5th of 1914, and that month alone, U-9 sank 3 British cruisers, persuading the German High Command to increase its submarine operations. Soon Germany declares the coast of Britain and the English Channel a war zone, asserting that all merchant ships travelling through it risked attacks. At the same time, Germany also promised to try and avoid neutral shipping. However, the British use of neutral flags made it impossible for Germany to do so effectively. The German submarines began torpedoing ships without any warning, arguing that surfacing first near merchant ships was too risky as they could be fired upon. Britain was indeed arming its merchant ships, legitimizing such claims. In February of 1915, the US gave Germany a warning about its misuse of submarines, and in April, Germany responded by warning US citizens not to board British vessels which might be attacked. Then on May 7th, disaster struck. The British passenger liner RMS Lusitania was sunk by a U-20, killing 1,198 civilians, amongst them 128 Americans. The American public was outraged, but Woodrow Wilson still refused to declare war, and instead began negotiations with Germany, who eventually agreed to restrict its submarine campaign.
Okay. Germany also, after the Lusitania, did dial back its attacks on merchant vessels substantially to avoid a U.S. response. And although there was some outrage in the United States, Wilson was certainly not holding back an American population eager to join the war at this point. Or he wouldn't have had to run for re-election using the slogan, "He kept us out of the war."
This became known as the Sussex Pledge. From then on, they would only attack ships that were definitely British, and head of the German Admiralty, Henning von Holzendorf, issued a secret order for all U-boats to stop operations in the English Channel and off the west coast of the UK, and instead to operate only in the North Sea. In November of 1914, Woodrow Wilson began to fear that his foreign policy would not succeed in Europe. While he privately considered military preparedness, publicly he rejected the need. In 1914, the president was presented a plan for military preparedness, but rejected it, stating it would be a shock to the American people, and that even if Germany won the war, the nation would be too exhausted and in no position to threaten the US. However, all this changed after the events of 1915, which sprang forth a strong military preparedness movement. The movement argued for the build-up of naval and land forces for defensive purposes under the presumption that the US would end up fighting in the war sooner or later. The movement was pushed by ex-President Theodore Roosevelt, General Leonard Wood, as well as former Secretaries of War Elihu Root and Henry Stimson. American industrialists and bankers backed the movement as it aligned with their commercial interests.
Woodrow Wilson also wanted to intervene in the Mexican Revolution, which was going on at this time. And he sent General Pershing, Blackjack Pershing, to chase Pancho Villa around Mexico when Villa became a guerrilla fighter and ended up fighting on actually both sides of the U.S. border. Wilson sent 5,000 regular Army troops, and he called up hundreds of thousands of National Guards and sort of reconstituted the National Guard. And so this helped to modernize the U.S. Army, bring it up to date, and also to kind of fill out the ranks.
The arguments for preparedness were quite valid. They pointed out that the militaries of most great powers were all larger and better trained than the U.S. military. Proposals were brought forward to increase the U.S. military to 600,000 men and to begin mandatory 6-month military training for all men who turned 18 every year. These proposals were rejected for a plethora of reasons, but Wilson managed to reach a compromise in 1916, enacting the National Defense Act and the Naval Act, which sought to expand the U.S. Navy to compete on the same level as the Royal Navy or Kaiserliche Marine.
One of the reasons that Wilson felt that public opinion was against him was because it was. Business leaders and social activists like Andrew Carnegie, Henry Ford, and Jane Addams were all pacifists. Poor Southerners reminded America that, quote, a rich man's war meant a poor man's fight. Samuel Gompers, the head of the American Federation of Labor, denounced the war in 1914 as unnatural, unjustified, and unholy. And socialist pamphlets argued that a bayonet was a weapon with a worker on each end. Woodrow Wilson, again, ran for re-election in 1916 using the slogan, "He kept us out of war." But of course, as we'll see, only a month after his second inauguration, Wilson was in Congress asking for a declaration of war in April 1917. So what really changed?
The preparedness programs were met with wide-scale protest by anti-militarists, placing Wilson in a lot of trouble as he was up for election in November of 1916. Despite this, Wilson and his "He Kept Us Out of the War" campaign won by a very narrow margin. By January of 1917, the situation in Germany changed. The German Navy convinced the military leadership and Kaiser Wilhelm II that Germany could win the war if they resumed unrestricted warfare. They argued that the Sussex Pledge was pointless because the US was not neutral, as they were supplying munitions and financial aid to the Entente powers, and by resuming unrestricted submarine warfare, they could defeat Great Britain within 5 months' time, before the US could land forces in Europe. Thus, the German government decided to resume unrestricted submarine warfare in January of 1917. Wilson was stunned by the news and went before Congress on February 3rd, announcing the US would sever diplomatic ties to Germany, but not declare war, as he believed the American public would still not support the motion. From February 3rd until April the 4th, German U-boats sunk 10 American vessels, resulting in the deaths of numerous American seamen and civilians. By February 26th, Wilson used an executive order to arm U.S. merchant ships, citing an old anti-piracy law. When Germany decided to resume its unrestricted submarine warfare, it did so with the assumption the U.S. would declare war eventually. To further thwart American transportation of supplies, war materials, or future troops against Germany, a plan was formed to establish a military alliance with Mexico. Since 1914, Germany had secretly armed Mexico, and even made attempts to incite war between Mexico and the US in 1915, tying down the US military and hindering US shipments to the Entente powers. Then a telegram was sent by Arthur Zimmermann to German ambassador in Mexico, Heinrich von Eckhardt. Since the start of the war, the British had cut the German international cables, and thus German telegrams were relayed through the Atlantic Communication Company under the control of the US Navy. The cable ran from Sweden to Denmark and onward to the United States. However, the cables also passed through a relay station at Porthcurno in England, which was secretly being tapped by British codebreakers in Room 40 of the Admiralty. The Germans persuaded the US ambassador, James W. Gerard, to accept the telegram in coded form to be transmitted to Mexico on January 16th of 1917. British codebreakers had broken the German codes and realized they held information that could sway the American public against Germany. But there was a major problem. To make it public meant the Germans would know Britain had broken its codes, and the Americans would know Britain was secretly tapping US cables. The British came up with a cover story, stating that British agents had stolen the telegram in Mexico, and would provide the Americans with the German codes to verify the message if the Americans did not make the German codes public. The telegram was sent to Edward Bell, American Secretary to Britain, on February 19th, and upon reviewing its legitimacy, it was eventually given to Wilson by February 24th. The White House released the information to the public on March 1st, 1917, while more US ships were being sunk by U-boats. American public opinion had changed dramatically over the 3 years leading to 1917. Prior to the Zimmermann telegram, the American public was divided into 3 groups: those who advocated for war against Germany, those who opposed war but were determined to defend America's national honor, and those who wanted to keep the US out of the war completely.
So when the decoded Zimmermann telegram did prove to be a suggestion from an official of the German office, the Foreign Office, to the ambassador of Mexico, that if, but only if, the US entered the war, Mexico might want to invade America to regain the territory that the United States had taken away from it in the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848. Now, at first, many Americans doubted the authenticity of this telegram, especially because it was delivered by British intelligence officers to this Secretary of the U.S. Embassy in London, Bell. Zimmermann, though, soon did acknowledge its authenticity, claiming, though, that he had only been suggesting a Mexican invasion if the United States had already entered the war. And the Mexicans, of course, for their part, announced that they had never seriously considered any type of German offer like this. So this did change public opinion a little bit. But when, on the 2nd of April, Woodrow Wilson returned to Congress with a war message, the message included a central argument that claimed, quote, "The present German submarine warfare against commerce is a warfare against mankind." And so Congress declared war on Germany on April 4th, 1917. But American public opinion still really hadn't changed that much, as we'll see.
British propaganda, unrestricted submarine warfare, and the Zimmermann telegram brought a large part of the American public to believe it was their moral right to fight to make the world a safe place for democracy. Now, the US government did not directly finance the Entente powers prior to its entry into the war. Nearly all the loans between 1914 to 1917 were syndicated by J.P. Morgan & Co. J.P. Morgan was the lead bank, organizing a cartel of other banks, selling bonds to private investors on behalf of the Entente powers. Cecil Spring Rice, a personal friend to J.P. Morgan, made him the sole purchasing agent for the requisition of war materials and weapons for Britain and France, because without having a singular agent, the Entente powers would be bidding against one another, and this would have driven up prices. This all gave J.P. Morgan incredible power within the US market to pick and choose which companies would get their share of the billions of dollars from the Entente powers. Everyone involved in the war supply industry scrambled to befriend J.P. Morgan. Soon all of these business orders and those who purchased bonds had an enormous stake in an Entente victory. If the Entente powers failed to win the war, they might default on all those debts to the US. The issue of finance becomes even more apparent when looking at the Siberian Intervention.
Okay, also, as not really mentioned here, although he is going to talk about the Siberian Intervention, in March of 1917, the Russian Revolution happened. And by March 12th, the Tsar, Nicholas II, had abdicated. So it would have been very natural for people to wonder, U.S. diplomats to wonder, and especially maybe U.S. bankers to wonder, what would happen if Russia was not able to play its expected role in the war on the Eastern Front? What if there was no Eastern Front? If the Central Powers could fight only in the West, might they not have a better opportunity to win? And if they won, what would happen to all that money that American banks had loaned to Britain and France? And finally, the Siberian Intervention is not about the repudiation of debt. Although the Soviet Union, once it got underway, did repudiate the debt. It was due to the US and Britain as well, actually, choosing the White Russian side, or the Tsarist side, in the Russian Civil War that went on from 1917 into the early 1920s. At the end of the First World War, the United States actually left troops in Siberia to fight against the new Soviet Union. That's something that we don't remember very well.
At the end of World War I, America was the largest wartime creditor, and over the course of the war, Russia's indebtedness rose dramatically, indirectly caused by America. Following the outbreak of World War I, J.P. Morgan was one of the first to loan $12 million to Russia. On February 8th of 1918, the new Soviet government repudiated all bonds issued by the Tsarist government and cancelled all previously issued Russian government debt. This caused a massive backlash from the Western governments who were the creditors. The Siberian Intervention was obviously not only due to the repudiation of debt, but the financial interests of the creditor nations was a rather powerful motivation. On March 21st, Woodrow Wilson gave his administration a week to prepare legislation for Congress that would authorize him to declare war. By March 28th, Wilson broke diplomatic relations with Austria-Hungary, and on April 2nd, Wilson addressed Congress. Wilson argued that because Germany had taken actions that violated American rights and international law, the US needed to enter the war to stop the German government. He stated that the US was fighting the German government, not the German people, as America was a friend of the German people. Wilson also stated that the US was entering the war to defend the ideals of democracy, liberty, and freedom. The war would make the world safe for democracy and be a war to end all wars.
So fighting the German government. The US government actually moved very, very quickly to try to eliminate any sign of dissent. It passed the Espionage Act in June of 1917. Woodrow Wilson declared that the act was designed to prosecute people who, in his words, poured the poison of disloyalty into the very arteries of our national life, who have sought to bring the good name of our government into contempt, to destroy our industries wherever they thought it effective for their vindictive purposes to strike at them, and to debase our politics to the uses of foreign intrigue. So, a little bit of conspiracy theory there. Although Wilson implied that the people that he intended to target were, in his words, born under other flags, most of them, like Eugene V. Debs, were American citizens. The law was actually expanded into the Sedition Act in 1918, which prohibited any forms of speech that could be considered, quote, disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of government in the United States, or the flag of the United States, or the uniform of the Army or Navy. So in addition to anti-draft activists, pacifists, such as the directors of the Watchtower Society, were also imprisoned. As the Russian Revolution was taken over by the Marxist Bolshevik Party, the prosecutors' concern shifted from draft resistance to socialism, and a Red Scare began in the United States. Hundreds of people were arrested and deported and jailed under the Espionage and Sedition Acts. And by 1919, even the authorities realized that they had gone a bit too far. And the U.S. Attorney General convinced President Wilson to commute the sentences of 200 prisoners who were convicted under the acts. Wilson, however, did not let Eugene Debs out of jail.
Wilson declared war with Germany on April 7th. By the end of World War I, the US had become the world's most important trading nation, as well as its largest banker. The Bureau of Internal Revenue quadrupled in size. The income tax produced 31 times as much revenue as it had in 1916. Nearly 21 million Americans, around 22% of the US population, had voluntarily subscribed $7 billion to the Fourth Liberty Loan. After the war, the US began investing large amounts internationally, particularly in Latin America, taking on the role traditionally played by powerful European nations such as Britain.
And this was just as Thomas Lamont had hoped and had planned, which he described in 1915. Now, Lamont went on to become a key figure in the negotiating party that the U.S. sent to work on the Versailles Treaty in 1919. The presence of U.S. troops, as well as all of that American money, had given the Americans an influential seat at the table at Versailles. Woodrow Wilson, who actually was the first American sitting president to leave the country, went to Paris as well, and he was seen as an international hero. But his appointee, Thomas Lamont, became a central figure in the negotiations that set the guidelines for the huge German reparations that ultimately bankrupted Germany and led to the Second World War. Wilson promoted his plan called the 14 Points, which receives a lot of attention from historians. But one of the main things is that Britain and France were able to get these punitive items that they wanted into the final treaty. And Lamont, of course, was in favor of that because this shifted the financial burden to Germany and all but guaranteed that the Allied nations would be able to repay the money that they owed to J.P. Morgan and the other American bankers. By June of 1919, the final version of the treaty was signed and President Wilson was able to return home. The treaty was a compromise that included not only these demands for exorbitant German reparations, but also provisions for the League of Nations and a promise of collective security. Woodrow Wilson didn't get all that he wanted, but Thomas Lamont did.
New York emerged as London's equal, if not her superior, as the world's financial center.
So again, although I enjoyed this video and I thought that it hit a lot of important points, I think it's the timing of some of these things that perhaps tells a slightly different story than the one that they had set out to tell. So I hope people found this interesting. Thanks for listening. I will see you again soon.